It had started off like any other ordinary morning, the kind that lulled you into believing nothing unusual could possibly happen. The sun streamed through the blinds in slanted golden rays, the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen, and the aroma of coffee lingered in the air. My laptop sat open on the dining table, a familiar blue glow spilling across the surface as I typed away, answering emails and checking deadlines. The soft tapping of keys echoed in the quiet house, punctuated now and then by the muffled sound of neighborhood life outside, lawnmowers buzzing in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog, and the faint drone of passing cars. Everything was calm, predictable, and routine, which is why the sudden silence of my network connection felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease across an otherwise peaceful day. At first, it was subtle. My video call froze mid-sentence, the familiar loading circle appearing where my colleague's face should have been. I frowned, clicking refresh, assuming it was just a hiccup. But then my email refused to load, my browser sat blank and stubborn, and even my phone switched from Wi-Fi to cellular data with a quiet notification that seemed almost mocking. My internet was gone. That in itself wasn't catastrophic, outages happened now and then. But something about the timing, the abruptness of it, and the fact that I had noticed a few odd stares from my neighbor earlier in the week, made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite shake off. I pushed my chair back with a sigh, walking toward the modem tucked near the entryway closet. Its usual constellation of blinking green lights was eerily different. Two of them glowed red, one flickered faintly as if struggling to hold on. I crouched down, unplugged it, waited the obligatory 30 seconds, then plugged it back in. Nothing. The same stubborn red lights stared back at me. My jaw tightened. I checked the cables, reseated them, even tried a different outlet. Still nothing. That creeping frustration began to climb up my spine, a familiar cocktail of helplessness and irritation that anyone who's lost internet mid-task would understand. But beneath it all, there was something else, an itch at the back of my mind that told me this wasn't random. I picked up my phone and dialed the service provider's customer support, only to be greeted with a cheerful but scripted voice telling me to wait for the next available representative. After 15 minutes of robotic music, a technician finally answered. He ran through his checklist, had me repeat all the steps I'd already taken, and then paused with a puzzled tone in his voice. "That's strange," he muttered, half to himself. "Your line isn't showing any outages. From our end, everything looks fine." I froze. "So why don't I have service?" I asked, pacing the room now, feeling the heat rising in my chest. "Well," he said hesitantly, "sometimes the connection can be physically disrupted. Maybe construction in your area. Or, if someone tampered with the line." That last word landed like a stone in my stomach, tampered. I immediately thought of the woman 2 houses down, Karen. She'd been a thorn in my side ever since I moved into the neighborhood. At first it was little things. A passive-aggressive note about my trash bins being slightly out of alignment, a complaint at the HOA meeting about my holiday lights being too bright, and, most recently, a lecture on how visible wires from my small satellite dish ruined the aesthetic harmony of the block. I had brushed her off, unwilling to escalate, but now the memory of her scowl and muttered threats came rushing back. Could she actually have done something? The idea seemed absurd, but as I stood there in the dead silence of my disconnected home, it didn't feel impossible. I hung up with the technician, who promised to send someone out within 24 hours, though his tone suggested I shouldn't hold my breath. My irritation had now shifted into a gnawing suspicion, and I found myself walking to the front window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street looked deceptively calm. Trimmed lawns, cars parked neatly in driveways, an older man walking his dog. But then I saw her. Karen stood across the street, watering a patch of flowers that didn't seem to need it, her gaze flicking up toward my house with a sharpness that made my skin crawl. For a moment, our eyes almost met, and she quickly turned back to her hose, a faint smirk playing on her lips. It was such a small thing, a fleeting expression, but in that instant I felt certain she knew something about my sudden blackout. The thought sent a chill through me, even as my rational brain tried to dismiss it. Surely no one would go so far as to tamper with a neighbor's internet. That was petty beyond reason. And yet, Karen had a reputation for exactly that kind of behavior. Small, calculated acts of control, the kind that left you questioning your own sanity while she stood there smiling, daring you to prove it. The rest of the afternoon dragged by in a haze of frustration. I tried using my phone's hotspot, but the signal was weak and kept dropping. I attempted to focus on offline tasks, but my mind kept circling back to the same uneasy question: was this a coincidence, or had Karen finally crossed a line? Every time I walked past the window, I half expected to see her there again, hovering just within view, watching for my reaction. By evening, the house felt unbearably quiet without the usual background noise of streaming music or a podcast. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, mocking me with its persistence. I sat in the dim light of the living room, scrolling through my phone, and stumbled across a neighborhood forum post written just a few days earlier. Someone had complained that their outdoor security camera cables had been mysteriously cut. Another neighbor mentioned a sudden issue with their satellite dish. The posts didn't name anyone directly, but the comments hinted at a common suspicion: must be the WA again, one wrote. My pulse quickened as I read on. It wasn't just me, something was happening here, and I was sitting right in the middle of it. The longer I thought about it, the more that word, tampered, echoed in my head. If Karen was bold enough to interfere with someone's property, what else was she capable of? My network going down had started as a minor inconvenience, but as the shadows lengthened across my living room, it began to feel like something more, a trigger that might set off a chain of events I wasn't prepared for. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew better. This was only the beginning, and whatever came next, it wasn't going to be simple. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, the silence of my disconnected home felt heavy, suffocating. I couldn't shake the image of Karen's smirk, the glint in her eyes as she turned back to her flowers. The thought burrowed deep, whispering in the back of my mind: this wasn't an accident. Something had been set in motion, and I had no idea how quickly it was going to spiral out of control. The next morning began with the same hollow silence, the absence of internet gnawing at every corner of my routine. I hadn't realized until then just how much the network had woven itself into the rhythm of my day. I reached for my phone automatically, only to remember that the Wi-Fi was still dead, and I was rationing my mobile data like water in a desert. The technician hadn't come yet, and the promise of within 24 hours now felt like an empty phrase designed to keep me quiet. I brewed coffee, sat at the table staring at my lifeless laptop, and tried to will the tension away. But the thought that Karen had something to do with this gnawed at me relentlessly, like a splinter lodged too deep to ignore. By mid-morning, I decided to step outside, partly to shake off the restlessness and partly to gauge the mood of the neighborhood. The sun was already high, baking the sidewalks, the air filled with the faint scent of freshly cut grass. A few houses down, I spotted Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who often walked her terrier past my place. She waved, her face soft with the friendliness that only came from someone who had lived on the block long enough to know everyone's business. I walked over, exchanging pleasantries, until the words tumbled out before I could stop myself. "Hey, did you have any trouble with your internet yesterday?" I asked, careful to keep my tone light. Her brow furrowed, and she shook her head slowly. "No, mine's been fine." "Why, yours went out." "Yeah, and it hasn't come back yet." I hesitated, then added, "It's strange, the company said everything should be working." She pursed her lips, glancing down the street toward the direction of Karen's house. Her voice lowered, conspiratorial. "You know, I heard her at the last meeting, going on and on about how some of us had too many wires hanging off our homes. Said it was a safety hazard, that it was ruining the neighborhood's look. I wouldn't be surprised if she had something to do with it." The words settled heavily in the air between us. I tried to mask my reaction, but my heart had already quickened. "Really? She said that?" "Oh, yes, Mrs. Green nodded, tugging her dog's leash as he sniffed at a patch of grass. "She's been making noise about it for months. Complaining about satellite dishes, outdoor antennas, even those little booster boxes some people have. She kept saying it was interfering with her signal, though no one understood what she meant by that. She's particular, you know." Particular was a polite word for it. I thanked her and made my way back toward my house, but her words buzzed in my mind like a swarm of wasps. So Karen had been talking openly about her disdain for wires, signals, and anything remotely resembling technology outside the pristine image she had of the neighborhood. The puzzle pieces were starting to align in a way that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Later in the day, I ran into another neighbor, Thomas, a father of 3 whose kids often played basketball in the cul-de-sac. He was leaning against his truck, sipping from a can of soda, when I approached him. We exchanged casual greetings, and once again, I found myself bringing up the subject. "Have you ever had issues with the HOA complaining about your Wi-Fi setup?" I asked. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, you mean Karen? Yeah, she hates that I've got an extender on the side of my garage. She told me it was an eyesore, said it could be against the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. I told her she'd have to pry it off the wall herself, and she didn't like that answer much." "She actually said that?" "Yeah," he nodded, his expression darkening. "She even brought it up in the meeting, tried to convince the board to vote on some new restrictions about visible tech equipment. Said all those wires and signals were destabilizing the community environment. I don't even know what that means, but she sure sounded convinced." I felt a shiver crawl across my arms despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. Wires and signals. The same phrase Mrs. Green had mentioned, the same obsession Karen seemed to be pushing on everyone. And now my connection had mysteriously vanished while hers, from what I could see, remained perfectly intact. That evening, I pulled out the thick binder of HOA guidelines that had been handed to me when I bought the house. Its weight felt oppressive, a tangible reminder of the invisible leash tied to every property on the block. I flipped through pages of rules about fence height, acceptable paint colors, the placement of trash bins, even the type of mailbox allowed. Buried in the middle was a section about exterior modifications and visible infrastructure. The language was vague enough to give the board sweeping authority but precise enough to single out anything they deemed incompatible with community standards. As I read, I began to see the outlines of Karen's strategy. She wasn't just meddling out of boredom, she was methodical, using the HOA's broad, ambiguous rules as a weapon to enforce her vision of the neighborhood. The internet outage was starting to look less like bad luck and more like the opening move in a power play. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, the binder still open on my nightstand, my mind replaying every interaction I'd had with Karen since moving in. The warning notes, the side comments, the way she always seemed to be watching from behind her curtains. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. She wasn't just annoyed with me. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something that reached beyond my house alone. The next morning, I stepped outside again, this time with sharper eyes. I noticed things I hadn't paid much attention to before. Small satellite dishes suddenly missing from rooftops, a neighbor's antenna gone, even a set of outdoor security cameras that had been quietly removed. Had these all been coincidences? Or had Karen, with her relentless complaints and sway over the HOA board, slowly pressured people into compliance? It was as if the neighborhood itself was being stripped of individuality, one violation at a time, until it conformed perfectly to her narrow definition of acceptable living. And then, as if to confirm my darkest suspicions, I caught sight of her again. She was standing at the edge of her driveway, clipboard in hand, scribbling something down while scanning the row of houses like a general surveying her troops. For a brief moment, her eyes flicked toward me, and though she quickly looked away, I could swear there was a flicker of satisfaction in her expression. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was fact. She was keeping track, making notes, preparing her next move. That image stayed with me long after I went back inside. The internet outage no longer felt like a personal inconvenience, it felt like a message. A warning that I was now squarely in her crosshairs. And as much as I wanted to believe I could ignore her, the weight of the HOA's rules and the whispers of my neighbors told me otherwise. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a shadow stretching over the entire community, and I was only beginning to understand just how far her reach could extend. The notice for the HOA meeting arrived like a summons, slid neatly into my mailbox in the same crisp envelope they always used. Normally, I tossed these aside, half skimming the agenda before burying it under a stack of junk mail. But this time, I didn't hesitate. My internet had been down for days, the technician baffled, and my suspicion had sharpened into certainty. If answers were going to surface anywhere, it would be here. I circled the date and time in red ink, feeling the faint pulse of anticipation beneath the irritation. This wasn't just another neighborhood meeting, it was a battlefield waiting to happen. The evening of the meeting, the community hall buzzed with that restless energy. Unique to gatherings where neighbors are forced into one room, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their sterile glow casting pale shadows across folding chairs lined in neat rows. A table at the front bore pictures of lukewarm water and a stack of agendas, but all eyes seemed to gravitate toward the long rectangular table where the HOA board sat, their faces a mixture of forced smiles and weary neutrality. And then, of course, there was Karen. She sat near the center, posture rigid, eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that reminded me of a hawk circling prey. In her lap rested a thick folder, its edges bristling with tabs and sticky notes, as though she had prepared a dossier on the entire neighborhood. When she spotted me, her lips curved into the faintest smirk, a flicker of satisfaction that only reinforced the sinking certainty in my gut. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries: approval of last month's minutes, updates on landscaping, a reminder about pool hours. The monotony lulled some into disinterest, a few attendees checking their phones or whispering quietly. But I stayed alert, waiting for the inevitable shift, the moment the agenda would pivot toward the real reason I was here. And when it came, it landed with the weight of a stone dropped in still water. Next on the agenda, the HOA president announced, clearing his throat, is a concern raised regarding what has been described as network hazards in the community. All heads turned, some confused, some curious. Karen straightened in her seat, smoothing the papers before her with an air of self-importance. Yes, she began, her voice sharp and unwavering. I've noticed, and many others have too, that our neighborhood has become cluttered with unsightly wires, satellite dishes, boosters, and all sorts of technical equipment that not only disrupt the visual harmony of our community but pose real risks. These so-called network setups are interfering with signals, creating potential health hazards, and undermining the safety and beauty of our homes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some frowned, others looked at each other with bewildered expressions. I felt my jaw tighten as she went on, flipping through her folder to produce grainy photos of houses with wires visible along their siding, a dish perched on a roof, even a router box mounted near a garage. She spoke with conviction, painting each image as though it were evidence of some great crime. Just last week, she continued, her gaze sliding deliberately in my direction, one of these setups caused interference that disrupted services for several hours. Imagine if it had been worse. What if emergency communication lines were affected? What if these tangled networks led to an accident? We cannot ignore this any longer. My blood simmered. The words were vague, exaggerated, and yet perfectly crafted to seed fear. And though she never named me outright, every glance, every pause in her speech felt aimed squarely at my chest. I raised my hand before I even realized it, my voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. With all due respect, I began, trying to steady the edge in my tone. That's not what happened. My internet service was cut unexpectedly, and when I spoke to the provider, they confirmed there were no outages, no interference, nothing from their end. What you're suggesting, health hazards, signal disruptions, there's no evidence for any of it. These setups you're calling dangerous are just ordinary equipment people rely on every day. A few heads nodded, others tilted, uncertain. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile tight. Of course you would say that, she replied smoothly, as though I'd confirmed her suspicions by speaking at all. But I've spoken with several neighbors who've had strange issues, dropped signals, power flickers, unexplained outages. And every time, it seems to trace back to homes cluttered with excess wiring. We need to take action before it gets worse. That's circumstantial at best, I shot back, leaning forward. Correlation isn't causation. If people are having issues, it could be anything: aging infrastructure, provider problems, even weather. But blaming neighbors for having internet access, or security cameras, or satellite dishes, that's not protecting the community, that's harassment. The board shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match. One of the members, a younger man named David, cleared his throat. I mean, Karen, do we actually have any verified reports? Like, from technicians or inspectors. Something concrete we can review. Karen bristled but recovered quickly, flipping another page in her folder. Technicians don't admit to it because they profit from these installations. But I've done my research. Studies show electromagnetic fields can disrupt not just electronics but human health. Do we really want to wait until someone gets sick before we do something? The word sick sent another murmur through the room. Fear was a powerful tool, and she wielded it expertly. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to call out her theatrics, because I could see the doubt seeping into some of my neighbors' faces. It was exactly what she wanted. This isn't about health, I said firmly, rising to my feet now. This is about control. We all moved into this community expecting a reasonable set of rules, not for someone to weaponize them to police how we live. If my connection goes down because someone decides my setup doesn't look pretty enough, that's not a community issue, that's sabotage. The word hung heavy in the air, sharper than I intended, but true nonetheless. For a moment, silence stretched across the room. Karen's expression hardened, the smirk gone now, replaced with a glare that could have sliced glass. One of the older board members finally spoke, her tone hesitant. Perhaps, we should table this for now. I think emotions are running high, and we'll need to gather more information before making any decisions. Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, then snapped her folder shut with a sharp slap, her face flushed with anger barely contained. She didn't look at me again, but the message was clear enough, this wasn't over. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors gathered in small knots, whispering, casting glances in my direction, in hers. Some approached me quietly, offering murmurs of agreement, saying they relied on their own setups and didn't want restrictions either. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to take sides. The board packed up quickly, clearly eager to escape the tension. I walked home under the streetlights, the cool night air failing to calm the storm in my chest. The confrontation had been public, undeniable, but far from settled. Karen had laid her case before the board, sowed seeds of fear, and though she hadn't won outright, she had planted doubt. And doubt, I knew, could be just as dangerous as a verdict. That night, as I sat in the stillness of my darkened living room, one thought kept echoing louder than the rest: Karen wouldn't stop here. The meeting was just her opening act, a stage to test her power. Whatever she had planned next, it would escalate. And I needed to be ready. The days following the meeting carried with them an uneasy tension, a kind of static in the air that I couldn't shake. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, curtains shifting in Karen's front window, the faint outline of her standing near her porch as if she just happened to be there at the same time. I told myself not to read too much into it, but deep down I knew she was watching, calculating, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. The board hadn't voted on her proposal, but that didn't mean she had lost. If anything, the meeting had only hardened her resolve. The first sign of escalation came late one evening. I returned from running errands to find a folded piece of paper wedged under my front doormat. At first glance, it looked like junk mail, but when I unfolded it, my stomach sank. The message was written in a neat but sharp hand: remove the equipment before someone removes it for you. No name, no signature, just that chilling sentence. I stood on my porch, the paper trembling slightly in my hand as the porch light flickered overhead. It was vague enough to deny, yet threatening enough to freeze me in place. I didn't need a signature to know exactly who had written it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows set my nerves on edge. I began to realize that this wasn't just about wires or signals anymore, it was about control. Karen wanted me to submit, to bend under the weight of intimidation. But instead of breaking me, the note lit a spark of defiance. If she wanted a war, I was going to give her one, but I would fight it on my terms. I bought a small camera the next day, the kind you could discreetly mount near a window. If she was bold enough to tamper with my property, I would catch her in the act. I set it up facing my front yard, its tiny light blinking reassuringly as it recorded. I also began documenting everything: the outage, the note, even small incidents like the time I found my trash bins mysteriously knocked over while every other neighbor stood upright. Each detail went into a folder on my laptop, labeled with dates and times. If she wanted to play games, I would keep the score. The proof came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, the camera caught her. The footage wasn't perfect, grainy under the cover of night, but unmistakable. Karen, in her pale sweater and rigid posture, walking up to the side of my house with something glinting in her hand. She bent down near the cable box, fiddled for a moment, then glanced up toward my windows before slipping back across the lawn like a thief. When I played the footage back, my hands shook with a mixture of rage and vindication. She had crossed the line from harassment into sabotage, and now I had the evidence. The question was, what to do with it? Part of me wanted to march straight to her doorstep, shove the footage in her face, and demand she stop. But another part knew that confrontation would only feed her hunger for drama. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I sent a copy of the footage to myself via email, uploaded it to cloud storage, and even saved it to a flash drive. If she tried to escalate further, she wouldn't be able to erase the truth. But Karen wasn't finished. A few days later, a patrol car pulled up in front of my house. I stepped outside, confusion swirling into dread as 2 officers approached. Their expressions were neutral, professional, but their presence alone made my pulse quicken. "Sir, we received a call about unauthorized equipment installations," one of them explained. "A complaint was filed claiming you might be running unlicensed broadcasting devices that could interfere with local communications." I nearly laughed at the absurdity, but the officers' faces told me this wasn't a joke. Karen had actually called the police on me. "I'm not broadcasting anything," I said firmly, ushering them toward the side of the house. "It's just standard internet equipment. Router, modem, and a booster for signal strength. All perfectly legal." They inspected the setup, their eyes scanning the box and wires, while I pulled up receipts and service contracts on my phone to show them everything was installed properly. After a few minutes, one of the officers nodded. "Looks fine to me. We'll file this as a resolved complaint." But as they turned to leave, I caught sight of Karen standing on her lawn, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared, her expression carved into stone. The officers gave her a polite nod before driving off, but the message in her glare was clear. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. That night, I sat in my living room replaying the footage again, the patrol car's flashing lights still burned into my memory. The escalation had reached a dangerous new level. Karen wasn't content with intimidation or sabotage anymore, she was trying to weaponize the authorities against me. And if she succeeded, I knew she wouldn't stop until I was painted as the villain in her carefully crafted narrative. I decided then that I needed allies. I printed still frames from the camera footage, slipped them into envelopes, and quietly shared them with a few neighbors I trusted, Thomas, who had clashed with Karen before, and Mrs. Green, whose kind eyes widened in shock when she saw the images. "This is too far," she whispered. "She can't get away with this." The more I shared, the more stories came out. A neighbor whose outdoor lights had been mysteriously unscrewed. Another who found their satellite dish bent out of shape overnight. A pattern was emerging, a trail of petty sabotage that all pointed back to her. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. But even as I gathered support, the tension in the neighborhood thickened. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward Karen's house as if afraid she could hear through walls. The air felt charged, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. And through it all, Karen carried herself with the same stiff confidence, clipboard in hand, jotting notes, filing complaints, spinning her narrative of being the protector of the neighborhood. I knew then that the real battle was about to begin. The cameras, the complaints, the police, it had all been a test, a way for her to probe my defenses. But now, with neighbors beginning to rally and evidence mounting against her, she would feel cornered. And someone like Karen, when cornered, was bound to strike harder. As I shut off the lights and headed upstairs, I caught one last glimpse through the window. Her house stood across the street, porch light glowing faintly, a shadow moving behind the curtain. Watching, waiting. The war she had started wasn't just about wires anymore, it was about control, power, and the lengths one woman would go to maintain her grip on a community. And somehow, I had become her greatest enemy. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday evening, a day that had begun like so many others, quiet, uneventful, and heavy with the unspoken tension of a neighborhood caught in Karen's grip. I had been sifting through emails on my patchy hotspot when a new message landed in my inbox, an official notice from the HOA board, citing pending review of potential violations related to my network equipment. The language was sterile, wrapped in legal phrasing, but the intent was clear. Karen's campaign was working. She had pushed the board into action, and now I was standing on the edge of becoming an example. For a moment, panic clawed at me, that instinctive fear of being cornered. But it quickly gave way to resolve. I wasn't powerless, not anymore. I had footage of her tampering with my property, neighbors who had begun to whisper their own stories, and a growing pile of evidence that painted her not as a concerned homeowner but as a manipulator who thrived on control. It was time to turn the tide. My first step was reaching out to a lawyer, a recommendation from Thomas, who had his own battles with the HOA in the past. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Martinez, listened patiently as I laid everything out: the outage, the threats, the police call, the footage. She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notepad. "You've got more than you think," she said finally. "What she did, tampering with your equipment, making false reports, those aren't just HOA issues. That's criminal interference and harassment. If she pushes this any further, we can file charges. But before that, let's use the system she's abusing against her." Her confidence lit something inside me. For weeks I had felt like prey, reacting to Karen's moves, caught in her shadow. But now, I had a plan. We drafted a response to the HOA notice, attaching stills from the footage, written statements from neighbors, and legal citations Martinez provided. It was methodical, factual, impossible to dismiss as mere he said, she said. The next HOA meeting came sooner than expected, the notice stamped urgent. The hall was more crowded this time, the air thick with anticipation. Word had spread, people knew about the complaints, the police visit, the escalating tension. Some arrived out of curiosity, others out of fear, but most because they were tired of the endless rules, the pettiness, the constant sense that Karen was watching. I sat near the front, folder in hand, heart steady but thrumming with energy. Karen was already there, of course, her clipboard stacked with fresh complaints, her smile thin and triumphant. She believed she had cornered me, that this meeting would cement her control. The board president cleared his throat and began. "We've received a complaint regarding unauthorized network equipment and its potential impact on the community. Tonight, we'll be reviewing this matter and hearing from both parties." Karen stood immediately, her words spilling out in rehearsed certainty. She painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege from rogue installations, of signals corrupting harmony, of safety compromised. She gestured toward me more than once, never naming me directly but making sure every eye in the room landed on my chair. The room buzzed with unease, some nodding, others frowning. She spoke as though the verdict was already decided. When she finally sat, the president turned toward me. "You've prepared a response." I rose slowly, placing the folder on the table, my voice steady. "Yes, I've heard the accusations, and I understand the concerns. But this isn't about safety or aesthetics. This is about harassment." I opened the folder, pulling out the printed stills from the footage. The room collectively leaned forward as I held them up. "This is Karen, caught on camera tampering with my equipment in the middle of the night. The same equipment she's calling dangerous." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face paled, her mouth tightening as whispers swelled around us. I didn't stop there. I laid out the anonymous threat I'd received, the visit from the police sparked by her false report, the statements from neighbors whose property had been mysteriously vandalized. Each piece clicked into place like a puzzle, forming a picture too sharp to ignore. "This isn't about community standards," I finished, my voice carrying through the room. "This is about control, and if the board allows this to continue, you're not protecting the neighborhood, you're enabling abuse." For a long moment, silence hung over the room. The board members exchanged glances, their faces tight with the weight of what they had just seen. Finally, David, the younger member who had seemed skeptical before, leaned into his microphone. "I think the evidence speaks for itself. We can't ignore this." Karen erupted then, her composure cracking. She shot to her feet, voice shrill. "This is a smear campaign. He's twisting everything. "You don't understand the dangers." But her words faltered under the weight of the stares fixed on her. The neighbors she had once cowed with fear and authority now looked at her with something different: recognition. Recognition of the patterns they had all endured in smaller doses: the notes, the complaints, the nitpicking. For the first time, they saw not a guardian of the neighborhood but a bully exposed in the light. The president raised a hand, silencing the room. "That's enough. The board will review this matter in detail, but I want to make it clear, we cannot allow one member to target others under the guise of community standards. Any further complaints must be backed by evidence, not speculation." Karen sat slowly, her face stiff with rage, her knuckles white against the edge of her clipboard. The meeting moved on, but the air had shifted. The fear she wielded so effortlessly had fractured, replaced by murmurs of support directed at me, nods from neighbors who had once kept silent. When the meeting ended, people approached me, Thomas clapping me on the shoulder, Mrs. Green thanking me softly, others whispering that they were glad someone had finally stood up. The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. As I left the hall, I caught her glare burning into me, a silent promise that this wasn't finished. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Walking back under the glow of the street lamps, folder tucked under my arm, I felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift. The battle wasn't over. Karen was too stubborn, too entrenched to give up so easily, but the balance had shifted. I had fought back, not with anger or threats, but with truth. And in a community where shadows had long been her weapon, the truth was finally dragging everything into the open. It was the turning point. From here, I knew, the fight would only escalate. But now, I wasn't fighting alone. The days after the meeting unfolded like the slow release of a storm that had hovered for far too long. For weeks, the neighborhood had been smothered by Karen's shadow, her endless complaints and her clipboard of grievances, but now the grip was loosening. Whispers circulated more openly. Neighbors who once avoided her gaze began speaking in low but certain tones, and for the first time since moving in, I felt the balance of power tilting away from her. Yet even as the air seemed lighter, the undercurrent of unease remained, because Karen was not the kind of person to simply retreat. The board acted faster than I expected. Within a week, an official notice went out, not addressed to me this time, but to Karen. It was written in the same sterile, carefully neutral language they always used, but between the lines, it was sharp as glass. The letter cited evidence of harassment, interference with personal property, and repeated unfounded complaints. She was warned that continued behavior of this nature would result in fines, potential suspension of voting privileges, and, if necessary, legal action. The letter was posted to every household as part of the meeting minutes, a quiet but public reprimand that stripped away the veil she had always worn. Everyone knew now. I should have felt triumphant, but the victory was complicated. Seeing her exposed didn't bring the rush of satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, I felt a heavy mix of relief and caution. Relief that the truth had been acknowledged, that I no longer stood alone, but caution because I understood Karen's nature. She wasn't just driven by rules or aesthetics, she was driven by control. To have that authority questioned, let alone stripped, was something she would never forgive. In the days that followed, her presence shifted. Where once she had stalked the neighborhood openly, clipboard in hand, now she lingered in the shadows. I would catch glimpses of her at her window, curtain twitching just enough for her eyes to peer out. Sometimes she stood on her porch at odd hours, watching silently as cars passed, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. She no longer shouted or confronted, but her silence carried its own weight, like the quiet of an animal crouched in the dark, waiting. Yet the community itself began to change. For the first time, neighbors spoke to one another not out of obligation, but out of shared experience. Thomas invited me over for a beer, telling me how his family had considered moving just to escape Karen's harassment. Mrs. Green confessed she had been afraid to speak up about her bent satellite dish because she didn't want to become a target. Even the younger families, once hesitant to get involved, started voicing their frustrations. The fear Karen had cultivated for so long was cracking, and in its place, a sense of solidarity was beginning to take root. One evening, as I walked down the street, I noticed something that struck me more than any meeting or letter could. A neighbor who had removed his outdoor cameras weeks earlier had put them back up, this time without hesitation. Another had reinstalled a satellite dish, proudly visible from the road. It was subtle, almost defiant, a quiet reclaiming of space, a refusal to bend anymore. I realized then that what had started as a personal battle had become something larger. Standing up to Karen hadn't just been about me or my internet, it had been about breaking the spell she had cast over all of us. But the story didn't end there. A week later, a knock came at my door. It wasn't Karen, she avoided direct confrontation now, but an envelope left on my porch, the paper crisp and folded with precision. Inside was a handwritten note, her script as sharp as the first one I'd received. You may have fooled them for now, but I see everything. This isn't finished. The words sent a familiar chill crawling through me, though I forced myself to breathe slowly, steadying my nerves. It wasn't a threat in the overt sense, but it was enough, a reminder that while she might have been publicly checked, her obsession hadn't burned out. She was waiting for her chance, biding her time until another opportunity arose. I reported the note to Martinez, my lawyer, who added it to the growing file. She assured me that every slip Karen made only strengthened the case should we need to escalate legally. People like her, Martinez said with a knowing look, don't just stop. They test boundaries. But now she knows you're not an easy target. That changes the game. Her words stayed with me, both comforting and unsettling. I no longer felt like prey, but neither could I relax completely. Karen wasn't gone. She had merely shifted tactics, withdrawing to regroup. The shadow still lingered, thinner now, but present all the same. Late one night, I sat at my desk, staring at the glow of my laptop, my internet connection fully restored, humming steady and reliable as if it had never faltered. The irony wasn't lost on me. Something as simple as a network outage had spiraled into weeks of tension, threats, confrontations, and revelations. Yet from that chaos had come something I hadn't expected, a sense of clarity. I had learned that silence, compliance, only fed the kind of power Karen thrived on. By standing up, by shining a light on her tactics, I had not only defended myself but helped others realize they weren't powerless either. The HOA, once a tool she wielded like a weapon, had been forced to confront its own failings. And the community, fractured by her control, was beginning to stitch itself back together through the shared act of resistance. Still, as I shut down the laptop and looked out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Across the street, Karen's house stood quiet, its windows dark, its curtains drawn. To anyone else, it might have seemed ordinary, but to me, it was a reminder, a fortress where she still plotted, still watched, still waited. Maybe she had been weakened, maybe she had been exposed, but she wasn't gone. And I knew enough now to understand that people like Karen never truly surrendered. They lingered, resurfaced, found new angles, new ways to claw back control. As I turned off the lights and let the house fall into silence, I felt both lighter and heavier all at once. The battle had been won, but the war, if that's what it was, might only just be beginning. And somewhere out there, behind her curtain, Karen was still watching.